greetings, and welcome to another episode of African News Review. Sorry for the slight delay. It was a technical hitch here in the royal capital of London. How are you, sir? You know,
Excellent, excellent. Good to
excellent.
see you, comrade.
Yes. Again, I'm your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is the uh, comrade Milton Alimadi, host of Blackstead News, WBAR, uh, author of the book Manufacturing Hate. Get a copy while you can. And most importantly, how are you, sir? How are you again? How are you?
Excellent. Always happy to wake up every day, man.
Yes, every day is a blessing. And we welcome our guests, those who are joining us for the first time, and those who is now part of a staple for them. Do like, share, subscribe, hit the like button, as we would say. And without further ado, let's go for the first story, which comes from the BBC, and it's about the captain, the good captain, as they will say, Captain Traore. And it reads, why Burkina Faso's junta leader has captured hearts and minds around the world. And there he is. And the lead goes, a charismatic 37-year-old Burkina Faso military captain, ruler Captain Ibrahim Traore, has skillfully built a persona of Pan-African leader determined to free his nation from what is regarded as the clutches of Western imperialism and neocolonialism. Your initial take from that lead alone from the BBC, what would you attribute that kind of headline to?
Well, I attribute it to the facts on the ground,
Mm,
to the mass popular support that this leader is been able
Ghana,
to
Ghana.
inspire globally,
Yep.
uh, as demonstrated in the protest digitally and in person. So,
Mm,
even the notorious BBC cannot evade the facts, you see. And obviously, this is something which is not new.
mm,
Uh, Thomas Sankara, excuse me, I'm fighting a cold, inspired the same type of support.
mm,
But Thomas Sankara, just as Patrice Lumumba before him in Congo, who also inspired the same type of support because they were challenging imperialism.
mhm,
Uh, those two earlier ones did not have the benefit of social media.
mm, mm.
They operated in the days when a handful of media outlets, um, dominated.
Mm.
The BBC dominated. BBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, they dominated media.
Okay.
And if we were still operating in that era, Traore would not be getting this coverage right now. You see?
Okay. Okay. So I'll dig a little deeper. And so it goes on. It says his message has resonated across Africa and beyond, and with admirers seeing him as following the footsteps of African heroes like Burkina Faso's very own Thomas Sankara, a Marxist revolutionary who is sometimes referred to as Africa's Che Guevara. And it goes on. His message reflects the age we are living in when many Africans are questioning the relationship with the West, and there is so much poverty in such rich continent. After seizing power in a coup in 2022, Traore's regime ditched former colonial power France in favor of a strong alliance with Russia. And that has included the deployment of a Russian paramilitary brigade and adopted left-wing economic policies. What can you glean from this paragraph alone? Ditched former colonial powers, now in bed with Russia, has a Russian paramilitary brigade, and adopted left-wing economic policies.
Well, strange as it may sound, it's not actually as hostile as before. And you know what? It's very hard to appear very hostile and negative
Yeah.
when you've already acknowledged that somebody's getting so much global support, right? Because now you're left in the situation of, okay, so you're telling us that he's adopting
Left-wing.
left politics and economics.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're admitting that he's getting global support.
Mhm.
So are you telling us that left economics and politics is actually very popular globally? You see what they're working with? Think about it. They're in a tight spot.
Boxed into a corner. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I'll continue. And it says the rule also applied to, okay, so now what we're going to glean into now is what that economic policy entails. This included setting up a state-owned mining company requiring foreign firms to give its, that is the state, a 15% stake in local operations and transfer skills to Burkinabe people. The rule also applied to Russian miner Norgold, who was given a license in late April for its latest investment in Burkina Faso's gold industry. Now, if you don't mind my asking, what is wrong with the state owning a stake in its own resources?
There's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, he's doing exactly what every African country should have done already and should still do.
Mm.
It's very hard for them. It's going to be hard. And that's what's been killing us, really. It's been killing us by the fact that in the past, they were the only ones who controlled narrative. You see?
Yes. And,
they dominated media. They told us this is what is good. But now you're telling us that globally people are celebrating a guy who's actually using the country's resources to benefit the country. Where is this world going to end up,
I mean, whatever.
In other words, they're exposing themselves, right?
Okay. And the article goes further. As part of what Traore calls a revolution to ensure Burkina Faso benefits from its mineral wealth, the junta is also building a gold refinery and establishing national gold reserves for the first time in the nation's history. I repeat that. Establishing national gold reserves for the first time in the nation's history. However, Western-owned firms appear to be facing a tough time with Australian headquartered Barrick Gold Resources launching arbitration proceedings against Burkina Faso in late 2024 following the withdrawal of an exploration license. The juntas go on.
So, ironically, a mere few months ago, that would be the headline of this story.
In fact,
that would be the lead of this story.
In fact, it was. If you remember the article we dealt
Absolutely.
with in the Financial
You
Times.
See how things have changed so quickly? Now, this is buried somewhere deep in the story. It's not blaring now. Western firms under attack in Burkina Faso by leftist regime. So that headline is now parked somewhere. I'm not willing to sing praises to the BBC, and I'll tell you why.
Go on.
Because that headline, Western firms under attack, And I'm not saying there is a headline like that already, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's one already written and packed somewhere, waiting to be used on the occasion they think it's time to use it. You see?
Mm.
So they
Mm.
go like this.
The swinging pendulum. Yeah. Yeah.
They have no principles. There's no moral compass. Right
Mm.
now, clearly, it is not the time to be going too aggressively against somebody you've already acknowledged is getting worldwide support. You see?
True. True. True.
But at the same time, they cannot fully embrace him, of course.
Because to do
So
so,
those of us who
mm,
read the BBC very closely are the ones who are able to analyze and say, compared to previous articles, they're actually praising him in this article.
okay. Then it goes further. It says Eric Randley Atkins, a researcher at South Africa's Institute for Security Studies and the BBC, said Traore's radical reforms have increased his popularity in Africa. He is now arguably Africa's most popular, if not favorite president. And then he goes into why. Mr. Ocheng said Traore first caught the attention of Africans when he spoke at the Russian African Summit in 2023, telling African leaders to stop behaving like puppets who dance every time the imperialists pull the string. The speech was heavily publicized by Russian media, which has become a major player in promoting Traore's Pan-Africanist image. Traore attended commemorations in Russia last week to mark the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. He posted on X, him and military leaders from neighboring Mali and Niger were inspired by it to winning its war against terrorism and imperialism at all costs. Thanks to the rhetoric pulled by a slick social media campaign, his appeal has spread across the world, including among African Americans and Black Britons, Ms. Ocheng said. Everyone who has experienced racism, colonialism, and slavery can relate to his message, Ms. Ocheng said, pointing out that African Americans rapper Meek Mill had posted about him on X last year, saying he much liked his energy and heart. And though he was ridiculed for mixing up the names by referring to Traore as Burkina Faso, but later deleted the post. But as they here's the pushback. But France president is not a fan, describing Traore as part of a baroque alliance between self-proclaimed Pan-Africans and neo-imperialists. What does he mean by that?
I have no idea, and who cares about what the French president, thinks? But there are a few interesting points that you read.
Okay.
So first of all,
Mm.
I like what Ms. Ocheng is saying, but she should not be afraid to speak her mind.
Mm.
So when you say he's the most popular, if not most favorite,
If not the,
what does that mean? What are you saying? How do you define favorite? Favorite to whom? You see?
Mm. Mm.
Why can he not be both the most popular and the favorite? So I think that was an unnecessary concession to the BBC, right?
Okay.
Is that the price of being quoted and making sure that they call me again in the future? So that was, gratuitous. There was no need for that.
Mm.
Most popular, not favorite. I mean, we are here to analyze, right?
Yes.
So that's one of the things I picked up.
Okay.
And then on the it's part of the BBC, that Russian media is also a main promoter So what is wrong with that, right? If Russian media is the main promoter of Traore, given the relationship they now have,
Yep.
but they make it appear as if that's something so sinister, and you know, unless it's being promoted by the BBC,
BBC. Yeah.
anything else should be uh, regarded as something sinister. And
Mm.
then I also like the fact that the article acknowledged something we mentioned from the get-go: the power of social media.
Yeah.
If social media existed, Lumumba never would have been killed. He would have been able to govern. You see?
Yeah.
Lumumba, in fact, the news about his murder, I think, was not available international until several days later.
Correct.
Now, things like this we would see in real time, you see?
Mm-hmm.
And this is very important in terms of checking the aggressive and brutal nature of imperialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's reflected in the tone of this BBC article. It's not fully endorsing the guy, but it's not hostile and critical as the many previous articles, because it's acknowledging the fact that there seems to be a lot of global popular support to what Traore is doing in Burkina Faso. And of course, how do we know that? Not because of the BBC or the New York Times or CNN. We know that because information is now widely disseminated
Yes.
on
Yes.
social media. You see?
Mm. Mm.
If they still had the monopoly that they had in the era of Sankara or the era of Patrice Lumumba, we would have no knowledge. First of all, it would be difficult to generate the type of global outpouring of support. You see?
Correct. Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
so those are points I wanted to make. But the French president is saying something predictable. It's not even interesting. You're only interesting if you're about to acknowledge the reality on the ground, that Africa has changed. You cannot impose your imperialism anymore. You threatened Niger after the coup. You said the coup should be reversed in 2 weeks. You, France, you were speaking through ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. 2 years later, that regime is still in place. The government is in place in Niger.
Mm.
So if Macron cannot take that as the evidence and proof that France is irrelevant, then I don't know any better example that I can
Mm.
give him.
Mm. Okay. One last part from the article, and it goes to a story we dealt with last week. Um, it's here. Where is it? And it's to do with. It's to do. Okay. Yes, it's here in a statement. Okay. So to set the tone for it, it's about the economy of Burkina Faso. In a statement in early April, the IMF said despite a challenging humanitarian and security environment, the economy was expected to remain robust in 2025, and the regime has made commendable progress in raising domestic revenue, containing the public wage bill, and increasing spending on education, health, and social protection. As for the World Bank, it said inflation has surged from 0.7% in 2023 to 4.2 in 2024. But the extreme poverty rate, which refers to people living on less than $2.15 a day, has fallen by almost 2% to 24% because of robust growth in the agricultural and service sector. Why is that important? Despite this report, US-based financial institutions' relations with both France and America has been frosty. A recent example of that was the head of the US African Command, General Michael Langley, said Traore was using Burkina Faso's gold reserve for his junta's protection rather than the nation's benefits. So, who do we believe? The World Bank, the IMF, or the good old general?
Well, the general has already been widely abused globally, that I don't want to heap any more abuse upon him. I think he has gotten enough attacks. But what I find very interesting
Mm,
is that the BBC actually has a balanced article on Burkina Faso. You see,
wow.
from the BBC to go out of its way
Mm,
to introduce the perspective of the IMF and the World Bank, that is in itself remarkable, you know, because these are the establishment financial organizations that are, in fact, whose role is to enforce neocolonialism
yeah.
and dependency in Africa. But the BBC goes and says, even these guys who are generally hostile to left politics and economics
Mm-hmm.
are giving this guy the thumbs up. And they place that ahead of General Langley before they introduce what he said.
Mm,
That is very significant for the BBC, for those of us that follow and read the BBC very closely. So this is a very significant concession. Overall, a very positive article about Burkina Faso and Traore by the BBC when compared to all previous articles on the same topic and same individual by the BBC.
would I
So I have to
be
acknowledge
would I be safe to assume now that you can recommend the BBC as a go-to news?
that. No way. No way.
That's a strong.
I'm waiting for them to give me another opportunity to start attacking them on Rwanda again.
Okay. So for the next story, we stay in the UK, we go to The Guardian. And this time it's Mr. Trump. And it reads, first group of white South Africans arrive in US after Trump grants refugee status. Trump has stirred controversy by calling Afrikaners, minority descended from Dutch colonists, victims of a genocide, in inverted commas. And there's the picture. Uh, the first group of white South Africans granted refugee status by Donald Trump administration has arrived in the United States, stirring controversies in South Africa as the U.S. president declared Afrikaners victims of a genocide. Um, I don't know. Do you have first thoughts on that, Elon? That is just
No, these are the descendants of genocidaires in South Africa.
oh, okay.
These are the descendants of Europeans whose hands were dripping with the bloods of Africans when they were buried. Their
Hmm.
forefathers and foremothers, their
Hmm.
ancestors.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were
Now,
quite brutal killers. They displaced Africans from their land. They killed Africans. They took over their land. And now uh, a fellow European who happens to be governing the United States is trying to whitewash history. But the
hmm.
facts are the facts.
Okay. So glad you've cleared that up. So first things first, it says the Afrikaners, a minor. This is the Guardian doing a. It's putting things into proper context. A minority descended from mainly Dutch colonists were met at Dulles International Airport, Washington D.C., by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Laude and Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security Tony Edge. Edgar, with many giving US US flags to wave. Very propaganda. At the Dulles airport, Laude told the assembled white South Africans, "It is such a honor to for us to receive you here today. It makes us happy to see you with our flag in your hands." He invoked his family's history, saying, "My own father had been in Europe and had to leave his country when Hitler came in. We respect what you've had to deal with for this last few years. He added, we are sending a clear message that the United States would reject the egregious persecution of people in the hands on the basis of race in South Africa. What?
So this, what is his name again? The guy who was quoted?
Christopher London.
You know, ignorance is not bliss. People that say that, I disagree. This guy is an ignoramus of the highest order. He says his family fled. Well, first of all, he's welcoming them in the sense that welcoming fellow Europeans. So that is not surprising,
Okay.
you know, because the Europeans in the United States exterminated the indigenous population, sometimes called Native Americans, you know.
Yeah.
So that in itself is not surprising. But his level of ignorance is just appalling. And that comes when you have this, you know, you pack government just based on race, not qualification. So the people Trump packed in government are packed in government because they're fellow Europeans, totally ignorant, you know? This is what you call affirmative action. In this case, this affirmative action of the highest order. Afrikaners wanted to fight on Hitler's side.
No,
Afrikaners would have killed your parents, you fool.
Please, could you repeat that part you just said now? Afrikaners wanted to do what?
The Afrikaners wanted to fight on Hitler's side on World War II.
Thank you very much.
So this ignoramus is saying, welcome, I also fled from Europe. So I actually like this. I'm saying bring all of them here so that our sisters and brothers can inherit the land in South Africa.
Of course. And then he goes on. He says, Trump suspended the U.S. settlement program in January, leaving more than 100,000 approved for refugees resettlements stranded. Then in February, he signed an executive order directing officials to grant refugee status to Afrikaners whose leaders ruled during apartheid while violently repressing the black majority. It is
I mean, the Guardian could do and should do much better than that in future. They did not suppress the black majority. They committed genocide in South Africa. So just flip it around and tell readers the truth, that these are not victims of genocide. These are the descendants of the people that committed genocide against Africans in South Africa. But be that as it may, let's continue.
Okay. So, and it says, this is Trump now talking. It's a genocide that's taking place, Trump told reporters at White House when asked why South Africans were getting prioritized for resettlement above victims of famine.
But the reporters are also incompetent. Why did they not then ask him, oh, Mr. President, how many of these whites have been killed? Boom. I wonder what he would have said. Oh, I don't have that information. Oh, if you don't, then why are you calling it genocide? End of story right there. You see?
True.
Sometimes you have these incompetent reporters as well who don't know when to seize opportunity. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes. Okay.
Nobody has asked him. I hope somebody asked him at some point.
No, I don't think.
How many people have killed?
There's no.
Do you have a figure of the number killed by this genocide and by whom? How long has this genocide? Was it comparable? Is it similar to what happened in Rwanda, when hundreds of thousands of people were killed over a period of about 100 days? Was it similar to that? Is that how it happened, Mr. President? Expose his total ignorance and expose the fact that this is stuff being fed to him by Elon Musk. You can do it by asking questions. That's why you have the privilege of being a journalist and access to a person who is as powerful as this person, the president of the United States. Ask him questions.
Yeah, but we have to be mindful that
Unbelievable.
these reporters work for a corporate organization whose
Then don't
motto.
bother writing the story at all, you know, because we're going to tear you down on Adesoji Speaks.
So, what you're saying is, this journalist was doing performative journalism, just being there.
No, but you know what? I think sooner or later somebody's going to ask him. And then sooner or later, these Europeans, and which is very sad, I want them to stay here because sooner or later people are going to start chasing them back to South Africa. I don't want them to go back there. I let them stay here. Because first of all, here, they're going to find millions of Europeans who are suffering in these economic conditions when all the wealth is being transferred to the very wealthy Europeans. The majority of impoverished people are, in fact, Europeans as well.
True.
In this country. True. You see? Because capitalism at some point really does not care whether those on the low level, the victims are Europeans or not.
True.
People keep forgetting the first exploited labor that colonialist Europeans used in the Caribbean and in what is now the United States were fellow white people. People, they emptied prisons from England and they called them indentured laborers. They kidnapped Europeans from the streets of London and brought them to work here as indentured labor, right?
Yeah.
Because the indigenous populations that exterminated them with diseases, they were not functioning well in these conditions of labor, so they exploited fellow Europeans. It was only much later the third group of people exploited were African enslaved Africans, right? So the point is, if they're willing to do that to fellow Europeans at that time, they do it again today, right? So these Europeans fleeing South Africa are going to find fellow Europeans struggling in this country, and they'll say, wait a minute. In South Africa, every European, even the most unqualified, which are the people coming here right now? Correct. A qualified European with assets in South Africa would not be running away, right? Correct. They'll find out that fellow Europeans are suffering this country, whereas in South Africa, every European, by virtue of just being white, is privileged. They will start running back to South Africa. And I hope Cyril Ramaphosa revokes their passport and citizenship and does not allow them to return. That's what I'm saying.
There was a
number two. Let me tell you the true reason why I like this story and why I like what Trump is doing, right?
Exposing.
And I hope it brings more and more Europeans here. Not only because it creates opportunities for Africans, but this is the main reason why I like it.
Yep.
The African National Congress is floundering. Economic freedom fighters are struggling in terms of messaging. There can be no better messaging that imperialism is so much against us to the extent that they're willing to call descendants of genocideers as victims of genocide and carry them and take them all the way to America. So we really have to fight for ourselves as Africans. So now Trump is giving them new messaging and new validation, you see, if they know how to craft this message properly. Correct. So that by the time of the next election, they're not performing the way they performed in the last election, you see. Trump is giving them meat to chew on. So I'm saying eat the meat properly.
And if you can, chew on the bone as well.
Take advantage of it.
So yes, that said, you now have new so-called victims. I mean, the system constantly plays themselves as victims, which takes us to the real story of victims next from France 24. And it goes, It reads, 4 decades on, still no justice for South African apartheid era atrocities. Victims of apartheid atrocities are suing the South African government for damages over failing to prosecute those suspected of committing apartheid era crimes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission put forward 300 suspects to be investigated for possible prosecution, but the vast majority were never pursued. And it goes on. On June 27, 1985, Kalata and his colleagues Matthew Gerlach, Sparrow, Morato, and Sikato Misuli drove to Port Elizabeth for a United Democratic Front meeting, but they never returned. Their desecrated corpses were found burnt with signs of torture, and they would become known as the Cradock Four. They have pulled my father's tongue out of his mouth, Kalata said, and they also cut off his ring finger. I don't know why, he said. Now, what do you think in light of the story we just read about so-called victims is the reason why these crimes have not been prosecuted?
Wow.
Almost 34 years, going on 34 years now.
Because we have a neocolonial government in South Africa. You know, we have a government that is not willing. We opened this discussion today by discussing what's going on in Burkina Faso and Traore. In South Africa, we have the opposite, right?
Correct.
There's a half-hearted attempt to address the legacies of apartheid. And the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes to address these legacies. Because at the end of apartheid, right, you have the raw memory of the brutality of apartheid, which is fresh on the mind of the victims and the perpetrators, right?
Yep.
And the global audience that has been witnessing apartheid in South Africa and the transformation of apartheid in South Africa. So you had stronger justification to take much more decisive actions at that time, you see? It's more like very similar to that argument of African unity that Nkrumah made. He said, you know what, with time, it's going to become much more difficult. So that's why we have to do it immediately. Let's come together, let our foreign ministers draft the articles of unity, and we just sign it, and we form a continental government. Even Nyerere, who opposed that approach, later on said Nkrumah was correct. He said, as these presidents became used to having the, sovereign entities, they became used to their national anthem, became used to their national. It became much more difficult. I'm wondering, did I lose you for a second?